He always believed his badge made him untouchable, allowing him to intimidate anyone without consequences. But when he took the wrong woman to court, everything changed. Evidence exposed his abuse of power, past victims spoke out, and the very system that once protected him turned against him. From predator to prey, he now faced the trial that would determine his fate. You won't believe what happens next. Subscribe and like now to stay tuned. The hum of the engine was the only sound Naomi Sinclair focused on. The night was calm, her route familiar. The day had been long, and she was minutes from home when she saw the glare of red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened, not in fear, but in exhaustion. Not again. She signaled, changed lanes, and pulled over. Her hands stayed where they could be seen, resting lightly on the steering wheel. This wasn't her first time being stopped. She knew exactly how to move, how to breathe, how to exist in moments like these. Officer Brian Carter stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his belt, his movements slow, deliberate. He approached with the ease of someone who had done this countless times before. Naomi watched him in the side mirror, calm, controlled. Carter stopped at her window, tapping it twice with his knuckle. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Just authority wrapped in impatience. Naomi exhaled slowly, then reached for the glove compartment, her movements practiced, deliberate. She handed him the documents. Was I speeding, officer? Carter barely glanced at the paperwork before responding. Tail lights out. Her brow furrowed. That was wrong. She had checked her car just last week. That doesn't sound right. His posture shifted slightly, subtle, but unmistakable. Are you arguing with me? There it was. The moment. The shift in energy. Power meeting resistance. Naomi kept her voice even. I just had it checked. If there's an issue, I'll get it fixed. Carter let the silence stretch before speaking. Step out of the car. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. For what reason? The smirk faded. Because I said so. Naomi knew this game. Knew the rules. Knew how it could end. She inhaled, forcing her pulse to steady, then unbuckled her seatbelt. The night air was cooler than she expected as she stepped onto the pavement, standing tall, but controlled. Carter watched her, assessing, deciding. He liked control. He thrived on moments like this. Hands on the car, he ordered. She didn't move. What am I being detained for? Carter's jaw twitched. Are you resisting? She met his gaze, steady. I'm asking a question. His fingers twitched near his belt, and before she could react, his hand shot toward his radio. Got a non-compliant driver here. Her breath slowed. This was the moment. The moment where everything could change. Officer, I need you to understand something, Naomi said, voice even, unwavering. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do. And I know exactly what you can't do. Something flickered across Carter's face. Annoyance. Amusement. Maybe both. Then, with a practiced motion, he reached for his cuffs. You're under arrest. Naomi took a step back, just enough to avoid his grasp. Under arrest for what? Obstructing an officer. Her mind calculated her options in seconds. Comply, and fight later. Resist, and risk escalation. The choice wasn't as simple as it should be. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms. Carter wasted no time. The cuffs bit into her wrists as he yanked them behind her back, tighter than necessary. Then, without a word, he shoved her toward the patrol car. She exhaled through her nose, steady, controlled. You don't know what you're doing. Carter chuckled, shoving her into the back seat. Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing. But he didn't. Not even close. The patrol car's door slammed shut, sealing Naomi Sinclair in the back seat. The hard plastic pressed against her back, the cuffs biting into her wrists. She exhaled through her nose, controlled, calm, as the weight of the moment settled around her. This wasn't the first time she had been in an unfair situation, but it might be the first time she was truly trapped. Officer Brian Carter strutted back to his seat, humming a tune as he adjusted the rear-view mirror. The satisfaction on his face made Naomi's jaw tighten. He threw the car into gear, pulling onto the road. The reflection of red and blue lights stained the pavement behind them, flickering in the dark like a warning. You know, Carter mused, glancing at her through the mirror, most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out. Naomi didn't answer. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He scoffed, shaking his head. But you? You had to make this difficult. His fingers tapped against the wheel. That mouth of yours got you into trouble, lady. Should have known better. She stared at him through the partition, unshaken. And you should have known who you were putting in cuffs. Carter's smirk flickered, but he recovered quickly. You military? Silence. Yeah, I figured. You've got that attitude. He chuckled. Above the law, think you're smarter than everyone else. Bet you thought I'd back off if you pulled that card. Still, Naomi said nothing. She had nothing to prove to him. The more he talked, the more he revealed about himself. Carter sighed dramatically. You know, if you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this. Her jaw clenched at his audacity, at the ease with which he twisted reality to make himself the victim. The station came into view, a squat, gray building at the edge of town. The parking lot was mostly empty, the late hour ensuring few witnesses. Carter pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, turned off the engine, and turned to look at her. Gotta say, he muttered, I do love when they make it easy. Before she could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. Let's go. Naomi twisted her wrist slightly. The cuffs were tight. Too tight. He had done it on purpose. But she refused to let him see her discomfort. She stepped out, head high, posture firm. She wouldn't let him take that from her. Inside, the station smelled like old coffee and sweat. A desk sergeant looked up briefly as Carter led her through, his expression indifferent. This wasn't unusual for him. Another day, another arrest. He barely even looked at her paperwork before waving them through to processing. Booking. Fingerprints. Mugshot. Naomi moved through the routine motions, her mind detached, observing. She had spent nights in far worse conditions, in places where the threat wasn't just humiliation but survival. This was nothing. Finally, Carter grabbed her wrist again, leading her toward the cells. Think you're smart, huh? He muttered. Naomi glanced sideways. I don't have to think. His grip tightened, his jaw flexing. Good. Let it get to you. With a shove, he pushed her toward the cell. She caught herself before she stumbled. The metal bars slid shut between them, and he smirked, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. Naomi took a slow breath and sank onto the bench. The metal was cold against her skin. One night. That's all it would take. Because Carter had no idea who he had just messed with. And he was about to find out. Naomi sat on the cold bench, her breathing steady, her mind calculating. She had been in holding cells before, different situations, different stakes. This time, she wasn't just waiting for release. This time, she was waiting for something much bigger. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Heavy. Purposeful. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Carter appeared in front of the bars, arms crossed, that same arrogant smirk still plastered on his face. Comfy? Naomi didn't answer. He leaned against the bars. You know, if you'd just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now. She let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips. Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be. The smirk faltered. A flicker of something crossed his eyes, annoyance, uncertainty. He covered it quickly, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area. No one's coming to get you tonight, lady. She tilted her head, unbothered. We'll see about that. Carter's amusement wavered. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble. Naomi stayed silent, letting him ramble. It didn't matter. He didn't know what was coming. Then, as if on cue, another officer appeared down the hall. Younger, nervous. He carried a clipboard, hesitating just outside the cell area. Sergeant, we got a call. Carter barely glanced at him. Later. Now. Naomi watched as Carter's face shifted. Annoyance flickered again, but something else joined it, hesitation. He turned to the younger officer, his posture stiffening. From who? The officer shifted on his feet. Someone high up. Said they had questions about your arrest. Naomi could see the tension coil in Carter's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched just slightly. He hadn't expected this. She leaned back against the wall, watching the unraveling begin. Told you, she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Carter turned back to her, his confidence cracking at the edges. What the hell did you do? Naomi's smile didn't waver. I didn't do anything. But people talk. And some of us have powerful friends. The young officer hesitated before speaking again. They're asking to see the body cam footage. Carter stiffened. Naomi didn't have to see his face to know the truth. He was screwed. Carter's jaw tightened. The weight of the young officer's words settled between them like a loaded gun. Naomi saw it, the moment he realized he wasn't in control anymore. He turned sharply, marching toward the hallway without another word. Naomi leaned back, exhaling slowly. The storm was coming, and she was right where she needed to be. Minutes passed. The station was too quiet. Then, the footsteps returned, faster, heavier. Carter stormed back in, his face tight with frustration. Naomi already knew what had happened. The footage had been pulled. The calls had been made. The questions had started. He gripped the bars, voice low and harsh. Who the hell did you call? Naomi met his glare with unsettling calm. I didn't call anyone. But like I said, people talk. His nostrils flared. This isn't over. She shrugged. Oh, it's just getting started. Before he could snap back, another voice cut through the tension. Commanding. Cold. Unfamiliar. Sergeant Carter. Step away from the cell. Now. Carter stiffened. Slowly, he turned toward the voice. A tall man in a dark suit stood in the doorway. Badge clipped to his belt. Federal. The kind of authority Carter couldn't shake off. The man took a step closer, flipping open a folder in his hands. Lieutenant Naomi Sinclair. Military service record exemplary. No criminal history. No pending infractions. He closed the folder, his gaze snapping to Carter. Tell me again why she was arrested? Silence. Naomi could hear Carter's breathing, heavy and uneven. He was drowning, and she watched him sink. The federal agent didn't wait for a response. Ms. Sinclair, you're free to go. Naomi stood slowly, stretching her wrists as an officer unlocked the cell door. She never broke eye contact with Carter. She stepped past him, pausing just briefly. "I told you," she whispered, her voice like steel. "You had no idea who you were messing with." She walked out without looking back. But Carter? His nightmare was just beginning. Carter stood frozen as Naomi walked out of the cell, her presence leaving a crack in his once unwavering confidence. The federal agent followed closely behind her, not even sparing him a glance. That was the real power shift, being ignored. The station's fluorescent lights felt harsher now. Every sound, the rustle of papers, the murmur of officers behind the desk, felt amplified. He had always been the one in control, but tonight, control had slipped through his fingers. Then came the voice that made his stomach sink. "Sergeant Carter, my office. Now." Chief Marcus Ward stood at the end of the hall, arms crossed, face unreadable. The hallway felt longer than usual as Carter forced himself forward. He could feel the weight of eyes on him. The same officers who once deferred to him were watching his downfall in real time. Inside the office, Ward closed the door behind them and tossed a folder onto the desk. Naomi's arrest report. The one Carter had filled out, twisting details just enough to justify what he'd done. "This?" Ward tapped the folder, his voice eerily calm. "This just got you benched." Carter swallowed hard. "Chief, I was following." "Save it." Ward sat, rubbing his temple. "You think I don't know how you operate? Pulling people over on technicalities. Pushing them just enough to provoke a reaction." Carter clenched his fists. She resisted. Ward's laugh was short, humorless. "The footage says otherwise." Carter's stomach twisted. Ward leaned forward. "Do you have any idea who you just arrested? You really thought no one would notice when you put cuffs on a woman with military connections and a spotless record?" He shook his head. "You played the wrong game with the wrong person." Carter's mind raced. "What happens now?" Ward leaned back, studying him for a long moment. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Internal Affairs is already reviewing your arrest history. And Carter, if they find even one more case like this, you're done." Carter gritted his teeth, nodding stiffly. He stood, fists still clenched at his sides. "Understood." Ward's voice stopped him at the door. "One more thing, Naomi Sinclair. She's pressing charges." Carter's breath caught for just a second before he masked it with a sharp nod and walked out. For the first time, he realized what it felt like to be powerless. Naomi Sinclair walked out of the station, the cool night air wrapping around her like a long-awaited victory. She rolled her shoulders, stretching out the stiffness from hours spent in a holding cell. But this wasn't over, not yet. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. "We're filing the lawsuit first thing in the morning. Civil rights violation, unlawful arrest. Carter's career is over." She smirked. "Good." Across town, Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of his suspension pressing against his chest like a boulder. His TV played the news on low volume, but he didn't need to hear it to know what they were saying. Sergeant Brian Carter under investigation for misconduct. His name, his reputation, crumbling in real time. His phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Carter." A voice on the other end was clipped, professional. "We need to talk. Somewhere private." He frowned. "Who is this?" A beat of silence. Then, "Someone who can help you. But not over the phone." Carter's grip on the phone tightened. His instincts screamed at him to hang up, but desperation kept him on the line. "Where?" An address followed, then the line went dead. Naomi, meanwhile, sat in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee as she scrolled through the latest headlines. Carter's suspension had sparked something bigger. Officers who had once worked under him were coming forward. Old reports were being pulled. The dominoes were falling. Her attorney slid into the seat across from her, placing a folder on the table. "It's worse than we thought. He's been doing this for years. But now, with everything coming to light, the department is scrambling." Naomi nodded, flipping through the documents. "They'll throw him under the bus to save themselves. And we'll be ready." Back in the dimly lit parking lot of an abandoned building, Carter stepped out of his car, eyes scanning the shadows. A figure leaned against a black sedan, face unreadable in the darkness. "You made a mistake," the man said, straightening. Carter scoffed. "Yeah? No kidding." "No," the man corrected. "Your mistake wasn't arresting Naomi Sinclair. Your mistake was underestimating who she is. And now, you need to decide, are you going down alone, or are you taking someone with you?" Carter narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" The man smirked. "I'm saying the people who protected you before. They're about to cut you loose. Unless you give them a reason not to." Carter swallowed hard. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now, for the first time, he realized he was expendable. Naomi had started a fire. And it was burning everything in its path. Including him. The courtroom was silent as Naomi Sinclair stepped inside, the weight of justice pressing against the walls. Reporters lined the gallery, cameras flashing, ready to capture the final act of a story that had spiraled beyond a single arrest. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced, manipulated, or abused by a system that protected men like Carter. At the defense table, Carter sat stiffly, his once confident demeanor shattered. The past few weeks had unraveled him. The department had cut him loose, offering no protection. Internal affairs had dug through his record, uncovering years of misconduct. Now, he was the one on trial. Naomi took her seat next to her attorney, her gaze steady, unwavering. She had been here before, on battlefields, intense negotiations, but this? This was personal. The judge entered, and the room hushed. The trial began. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out everything: body cam footage, racial profiling statistics, testimonies from victims too afraid to speak until now. Carter wasn't just guilty of arresting Naomi unlawfully. He was guilty of a pattern. A career built on intimidation and abuse. Naomi watched as each piece of evidence chipped away at the man who had once thought he was untouchable. Carter squirmed, his attorney whispering frantically in his ear, but there was no saving him. Then, the moment came. Naomi was called to the stand. She walked with purpose, shoulders squared. Taking her seat, she met the prosecutor's gaze and nodded. The questions came swiftly. "Ms. Sinclair, on the night of your arrest, did you resist?" "No." "Did Sergeant Carter provide a lawful reason for your detainment?" "No." "What was his demeanor toward you?" Naomi exhaled, then answered. "He treated me like I was beneath him. Like I had no right to question him. He assumed that because of my skin color, I wouldn't have power. He was wrong." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution pressed on. "And when you were taken into custody, did he ever explain your charges?" "He didn't have to. He made them up as he went." Carter flinched. The defense attorney stood, objecting, but the judge waved him off. "Ms. Sinclair, what do you hope comes from this trial?" Naomi looked at Carter, then across the room to the spectators, the reporters, the people watching this unfold across the country. "I want accountability. I want people to know that just because someone wears a badge, it doesn't mean they're above the law. I want every officer like Carter to know that they can't operate unchecked anymore." The prosecution nodded. No further questions. Naomi stepped down, her words lingering in the air like a final blow. The trial didn't last much longer. The evidence was undeniable. Carter was found guilty on multiple counts: abuse of power, falsifying reports, wrongful arrest. His sentencing would come later, but the damage was already done. He was finished. Outside the courthouse, Naomi stood on the steps as reporters shouted questions. She didn't need to answer. The verdict had spoken for itself. Her attorney joined her. "It's over." Naomi looked toward the horizon, inhaling deeply. "No. It's just beginning." Because this wasn't just about Carter. This was about the system that created him. And she wasn't done fighting. Not even close.